The red dust of Mars swirled against the dome of Outpost Sigma 7 as Thomas Chen finished calibrating the atmospheric processors. Another day, another adjustment to the delicate machinery that would eventually help transform this alien world into something more hospitable for human life. The work was precise, demanding, but Thomas found peace in it. As a third-generation terraforming engineer, he understood that changing worlds took time, patience, and an intimate understanding of both technology and natural systems. He never expected that these same skills would soon be needed for something far beyond Mars. The notification came through his neural interface with a gentle chime. Priority message from the Galactic Council. Thomas almost dismissed it as spam. What would the Council want with a terraforming engineer? But something about the formal encryption markers made him pause. With a mental command, he opened the message. A holographic seal materialized before him, showing the intricate crest of the Zelvirian Duchy, one of the oldest noble houses in the Perseus Arm. The message was brief but world-shattering. By decree of the late Duke Zelthor of the Zelvirian Duchy, you, Thomas Chen of Earth, are hereby named heir to the duchy and guardian to his daughter, Duchess Cythera. Your presence is required within 3 standard cycles at the Ducal Palace on Zelver Prime. Thomas read the message 3 times before its implications began to sink in. He had never met Duke Zelthor, had never even been to that part of space. Yet here he was, named heir to one of the most prestigious alien noble houses in the galaxy. It had to be a mistake. But it wasn't. Within hours, a Zelvirian diplomatic ship entered Mars orbit, its sleek crystalline hull catching the sunlight in ways that made human spacecraft look primitive by comparison. The ship's captain, a tall, elegant being with iridescent scales and compound eyes, presented credentials that were impossible to dispute. The late Duke was most specific in his will, the captain explained as they approached Zelver Prime 2 days later. He spent his final years studying human civilization, particularly your species' ability to transform hostile environments into habitable worlds. He became convinced that this expertise was crucial for the duchy's future. Thomas watched through the ship's viewport as they descended toward Zelver Prime. The planet was beautiful in an alien way. Purple oceans, crystalline mountain ranges, and cities that seemed to grow organically from the landscape. But he could also see signs of environmental stress. Vast dead zones in the oceans, atmospheric disturbances that shouldn't exist naturally, and what looked like massive environmental containment fields around several population centers. The Ducal Palace was a marvel of bioengineering and crystalline architecture, but Thomas had little time to admire it before being thrust into a meeting of the Ducal Council. 24 alien nobles, each representing different factions within the duchy, sat around a massive table that seemed to be grown from living crystal. At the head of the table sat a figure that made Thomas's breath catch. Duchess Cythera was nothing like what he expected. The whispers he'd heard during his journey had painted her as grotesque by Zelvirian standards. Too tall, too angular, her scales the wrong color. But to Thomas's human eyes, she was striking. Her scales shifted between deep purple and midnight blue, and her eyes held an intelligence that seemed to pierce right through him. "So," she said, her translator rendering her words in perfect English, "you are the human my father chose to help save our world." There was no mockery in her voice, only careful assessment. The other council members were less diplomatic. "This is absurd," one noble declared, his scales flashing angry red. "A human cannot possibly understand the complexities of our society, our biology, our needs. The duchy will be laughingstock of the Galactic Council," another added. "Our trading partners will abandon us." Thomas listened to their complaints, but his attention was drawn to the environmental data scrolling across his neural interface. The duchy's problems were worse than they appeared from orbit. The crystalline ecology that formed the backbone of Zelvirian civilization was degrading, and no one seemed to understand why. He stood up, interrupting the chorus of complaints. "Your world is dying," he said simply. "Your environmental systems are collapsing at a molecular level. That's why Duke Selfor chose me, isn't it? Not to rule, but to heal." The room fell silent. Farah's scales shifted to a deep blue that his interface identified as indicating respect or recognition. "My father spent his final years searching for someone who could understand both the technology and the natural systems of our world," she said. "The fact that he chose a human was no accident. We have tried everything our science knows, and still our world dies. Perhaps it is time for a different perspective." Thomas nodded slowly, his mind already racing with possibilities. The Zelvirian crystalline ecology wasn't so different from the systems he worked with on Mars. Complex, interconnected, requiring a delicate balance of artificial and natural processes. The scale was different, the specific challenges unique, but the underlying principles were the same. "I'll help," he said, "but I need to understand everything. Your technology, your biology, your social systems, all of it. And I'll need your help," he added, looking directly at Kythera. "You know this world better than anyone." The Duchess's scales rippled with what might have been surprise or amusement. "The human wants to learn rather than simply command," she observed. Perhaps my father's choice was wiser than even he knew. As the council chamber erupted into fresh arguments, Thomas met Kythera's gaze. In that moment, an understanding passed between them. The challenges ahead were enormous, environmental, political, cultural, but they would face them together. Human ingenuity and Zelvirian wisdom, working in harmony to save a dying world. The real work was just beginning. The laboratories beneath the ducal palace were unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. Crystalline computers merged seamlessly with biological systems, creating an environment that was both laboratory and living organism. Farah moved through the space with practiced grace, her scales reflecting the bioluminescent light that pulsed through the walls. "My father spent his final years here," she said, activating a holographic display with a gesture, "trying to understand why our world was failing." The display showed the degradation of Zelver Prime's crystalline ecology, a complex network of living crystal that formed the backbone of their civilization. The damage was spreading like a cancer, corrupting the delicate lattices that made their technology possible. Thomas studied the data, his neural interface translating the alien measurements into terms he could understand. "Your father was brilliant," he said, noting the innovative but ultimately unsuccessful attempts to halt the degradation. But he was looking at it from a Zelvirian perspective. "Sometimes you need fresh eyes." Kythera's scales shifted to a deep violet, a color Thomas was learning to associate with intense focus. That's what he believed. It's why he chose you, despite the opposition of the council. Despite, she hesitated, despite what they say about me. Thomas turned to face her. In the 2 weeks since his arrival, he'd heard the whispers, seen the looks from other nobles. Kythera's unusual appearance, her height, her coloring, the intensity of her intelligence, made her an outsider among her own people. "They call you ugly," he said quietly. "But they're wrong." Her scales rippled with surprise. "You don't understand our standards of beauty." "Maybe not," Thomas agreed, "but I understand prejudice when I see it. And I understand that your father chose me not just for my terraforming expertise, but because he knew what it was like to see beyond surface appearances." Kythera moved to another console, but not before Thomas caught the flash of emotion across her scales. "My father was different," she said. "He believed that our obsession with traditional forms of beauty and protocol was holding us back. That's why he conducted his own genetic experiments, trying to create a new kind of Zelvirian, one better suited to face the challenges ahead." The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. "You're not just his daughter," he said. "You're his experiment." The first of what he hoped would be a new generation, Kythera confirmed. Engineered for intelligence, adaptability, and resilience rather than conventional beauty. The council was horrified. "They would have had me removed from the succession if they could, but my father's position was too strong." Thomas processed this revelation, seeing the situation in a new light. The environmental crisis, The political resistance, Cthera's isolation, it was all connected. That's why he chose me, he said slowly. Not just for my technical skills, but because he knew I wouldn't be bound by Zelvirian prejudices. Yes, Cthera said softly. He believed that saving our world would require more than just technical solutions. It would require changing how we think, how we define ourselves as a species. The Council fears this change. They fear you because you represent everything they resist. Different perspectives, different values, different ways of being. A commotion from above interrupted their conversation. Through the crystal walls, they could hear raised voices and the sound of many feet approaching. Cthera's scales shifted to alarm colors. The preservation faction, she said. They're moving faster than I expected. What do you mean? They're trying to invalidate my father's will, to remove both of us from power before we can implement any changes. She moved quickly to a security console, her fingers dancing across the crystalline interface. They'd gathered evidence, or manufactured it, claiming that my father was mentally unstable when he named you heir, that his genetic experiments, including me, were signs of his deteriorating judgment. Thomas felt a surge of anger, not just at the political machinations, but at the short-sightedness behind them. Your world is dying, he said, and they're worried about maintaining their precious status quo. Cthera's scales showed grim amusement. Welcome to Zelvirian politics. She finished whatever she was doing at the console and turned to face him. We have two choices. We can surrender to the preservation faction, let them install a proper heir who will continue the same failed policies until our world collapses, or we can fight. How? My father left us more than just his title. He left us his research, his vision, and a network of allies who share it. But to use these resources, we'll have to work together. Trust each other completely. Are you willing to do that with someone your own people might consider a monster? Thomas looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her bearing, the beauty in her uniqueness. But more than that, he saw a kindred spirit, someone who understood that progress required breaking free from comfortable patterns, taking risks, seeing possibilities where others saw only problems. I've never been good at following other people's rules about what's normal or acceptable, he said, and I didn't come here to preserve the status quo. I came here to help save a world. He held out his hand, a human gesture of partnership. Let's show them what a human engineer and a genetic experiment can do together. Cthera's scales rippled with colors Thomas had never seen before, complex patterns that his interface couldn't translate. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in his. The texture of her scales was cool and smooth against his skin, and he could feel the strength in her grip. Above them, the sounds of the approaching faction grew louder, but in that moment, neither Thomas nor Cthera was afraid. They had found something more powerful than political maneuvering or social prejudice. They had found understanding in difference, strength in partnership, and the beginnings of something that could change not just Zelver Prime, but the relationship between humans and Zelvirians forever. The real revolution was about to begin. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Ducal Palace blazed with bioluminescence as hundreds of noble houses gathered for the emergency session. Thomas stood before them, his terraforming engineer's uniform a stark contrast to the ornate crystalline garments of the Zelvirian nobility. Thera stood beside him, her unusual height making her tower over most of the assembly. The evidence is clear. Lord Vexthor, leader of the preservation faction, projected his voice across the chamber. Duke Zelthor's final years were marked by increasingly erratic behavior. The genetic modifications of his own daughter, the obsession with human terraforming techniques, and finally, the appointment of a human heir, these are not the actions of a sound mind. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. Thomas could see the patterns of prejudice and fear playing out in the shifting colors of the noble scales. But he had spent the last week preparing for this moment, working with Cthera to understand not just the environmental crisis, but the deeper cultural currents that threatened to doom Zelver Prime. "You speak of erratic behavior," Thomas said, his voice calm but carrying. "Let's examine that claim with data." He activated the central holographic display, filling the chamber with a three-dimensional model of Zelver Prime's degrading crystalline ecology. "Your world is dying. Not from some external threat, but from the very practices you consider traditional and proper." The model zoomed in, showing the molecular structure of the living crystals that formed the backbone of Zelverian civilization. "Your current methods of energy extraction and resource management are destroying the very foundation of your society." Duke Selthor didn't go mad. He saw the truth that you're all desperate to ignore. Lord Vexthor's scales flushed with anger. "And you propose to save us with human methods? To corrupt our pure crystalline technology with crude terraforming techniques?" "No." Kythera stepped forward, her voice ringing with authority. "We propose to save our world by combining the best of both civilizations. My father didn't choose Thomas because he was human, but because he understands something you've forgotten. That adaptation is not corruption. It is survival." She gestured, and the holographic display shifted to show the results of their week's work in the underground laboratory. "We've developed a hybrid approach that combines Zelverian crystal tech with human environmental engineering principles. Initial tests show a 60% reduction in ecological degradation rates." The assembly erupted in shocked discussions. Thomas could see the impact of their revelation. It was one thing to dismiss their leadership on political grounds, quite another to ignore a potential solution to the crisis that threatened their entire civilization. But Lord Vexthor wasn't finished. "Even if what you say is true, it doesn't change the fact that accepting human leadership would make us a laughingstock in the Galactic Council. Our trading partners, our allies, they would abandon us." "Would they?" Thomas challenged. "Or would they see a civilization brave enough to embrace change when necessary, strong enough to look beyond ancient prejudices to ensure its survival?" He turned to address the entire assembly. "You call yourselves a superior civilization, but superior civilizations don't die because they're too proud to adapt." The chamber fell silent. In that moment, Thomas felt the weight of centuries of tradition and prejudice balanced against the immediate threat of extinction. Then, from the back of the chamber, a voice spoke up. "House Kelvor supports the human heir and Duchess Kythera." Another voice joined in. "House Zintal stands with them as well." More voices followed, a cascade of support that left Lord Vexthor's scales paling to a sickly gray. But Thomas knew this wasn't just about winning a political battle. He turned to Kythera, speaking quietly. "We need to move fast. Show them real results before opposition can reorganize." Kythera nodded, her scales showing determination. "The northwestern crystal fields are the most degraded. If we can stabilize them, we prove everything we've claimed." Thomas finished. "But it'll be dangerous. The crystal fields are highly unstable." "Then we'll go together," Kythera said. "My father's modifications gave me enhanced resistance to crystal radiation. And you?" Her scales shifted to a color Thomas had learned meant affectionate amusement. "You're too stubborn to die." The assembly was still in chaos, various factions arguing and forming new alliances. But Thomas and Kythera were already moving, heading for the underground laboratory where their equipment waited. They had won the first battle, but the real test lay ahead. As they prepared for their mission, Thomas caught Kythera studying him. "What is it?" "You didn't have to do this," she said. "You could have refused the inheritance, returned to your simple life on Mars." Thomas thought about the red dust of Mars, the quiet predictability of his old life. Then he looked at Kythera, at the challenge and possibility she represented. "Simple isn't always better," he said. "Sometimes the most worthwhile things are the most complicated." Her scales rippled with colors that his interface still couldn't fully translate, but he was learning to understand anyway. Together, they stepped into the transport that would take them to the crystal fields, ready to prove that the most powerful force in the galaxy wasn't tradition or purity, but the willingness to embrace change and grow stronger for it. The real test was about to begin. The northwestern crystal field stretched to the horizon, a vast expanse of fractured beauty. Massive crystal formations jutted from the purple soil, their once pristine surfaces now clouded and cracking. The air itself seemed to shimmer with radiation, creating ghostly patterns that Thomas's environmental suit struggled to filter. "The degradation is worse than the scans showed," Cthera said, her voice tight with concern. She stood beside him at the edge of the field, her modified biology allowing her to withstand the radiation levels that would kill an unprotected being in minutes. "The crystal matrix is approaching critical instability." Thomas checked the readings on his suit's displays. The crystalline structures were breaking down at a molecular level, releasing waves of energy that threatened to trigger a cascade failure. If that happened, the destruction would spread across the planet's crystal networks like a virus, potentially destroying Zelvirian civilization in a matter of weeks. "We have to try," he said, beginning to unpack the hybrid equipment they had developed. "Your father's research showed that the degradation starts at the molecular level, but conventional Zelvirian technology can't interface with the crystals without accelerating the breakdown." Thera helped him set up the first stabilization node, her movements precise despite the danger surrounding them. "And your human terraforming techniques. We're used to working with hostile environments, adapting our technology to work with natural systems, rather than trying to force them to conform to our expectations." Thomas activated the node, watching as it began to emit a carefully calibrated field that mimicked the natural resonance of healthy crystals. "The key is to support the existing structures while gradually introducing the changes they need to heal." They worked their way across the field, setting up a network of nodes in a pattern that Thomas had calculated would provide maximum coverage with minimum disruption. Each step had to be perfectly placed. One wrong move could trigger the very cascade they were trying to prevent. "Tell me about Mars," Cthera said as they worked, her voice curious. "What made you choose to spend your life transforming hostile worlds?" Thomas thought about it as he calibrated another node. "I suppose I've always been drawn to potential, seeing what something could become rather than just what it is. Mars is harsh, yes, but also beautiful. And with the right approach, with patience and understanding, it can become something amazing without losing what makes it unique." Cthera's scales shifted in a pattern he was beginning to recognize as thoughtful appreciation. "Like what my father tried to do with me. See the potential for something new without destroying what came before." "Exactly," Thomas said, looking at her. Under the alien sun, her scales shimmered with colors that no human language had words for. Beauty doesn't have to fit a predetermined pattern. Sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones that dare to be different. A sudden alarm from their equipment interrupted the moment. The reading showed a dangerous spike in crystal instability spreading from the center of the field. "The degradation is accelerating," Thera said, her scales paling with alarm. "The network isn't stabilizing fast enough." Thomas studied the data streaming across his display, his mind racing. "We need to increase the resonance field strength, but that risks overloading the nodes. If they overload, the feedback could trigger the very cascade we're trying to prevent," Cthera warned. "Unless..." Thomas's eyes widened as an idea struck him. "Your father's modifications, they didn't just make you resistant to crystal radiation, did they? They let you interface with the crystal networks directly." Thera's scales flickered with understanding and fear. "Yes, but attempting to interface with an unstable field this large could be fatal. Not if you have help." Thomas began rapidly reconfiguring the nodes. "I can use the terraforming interfaces to create a buffer, filter the worst of the feedback. But I'll need you to make the actual connection. You can communicate with the crystals in a way my technology never could." For a moment, Cthera was silent, her scales swirling with complex emotions. Then she straightened, seeming to come to a decision. "My father believed that salvation would come from combining our strengths, not clinging to separate paths. Show me what to do." Working together, they modified the stabilization network. Thomas's terraforming technology would create a protective framework, while Cthera would reach out directly to the dying crystal matrix, using her unique abilities to guide it back toward health. It was dangerous, unprecedented, and their only chance. "Ready?" Thomas asked, his hand hovering over the activation control. Cthera placed her hand over his. "Together," she said. They activated the system. Cthera gasped as she connected with the crystal matrix, her scales blazing with light as she channeled energies no human could comprehend. Thomas watched his displays, carefully modulating the protective field, filtering the feedback that threatened to overwhelm both their systems. The air itself seemed to sing as waves of energy pulsed through the crystal field. Slowly, impossibly, the clouded surfaces began to clear. Cracks sealed themselves. The dangerous radiation levels started to drop. "It's working," Thomas breathed, hardly daring to believe it. "The crystal matrix is stabilizing, regenerating itself using our combined template." Cthera couldn't respond. All her concentration focused on maintaining the delicate connection with the crystal network. But her scales had taken on a new pattern, one that combined the precise geometry of Zelvirian crystal tech with flowing, organic forms that seemed almost human in their irregularity. As the sun set over the healing crystal field, Thomas realized they had created something unprecedented, not just a technical solution, but a true synthesis of human and Zelvirian approaches. A new way forward that honored the past while embracing change. When Cthera finally disconnected from the network, she was exhausted but triumphant. "We did it," she said, swaying slightly. Thomas caught her arm, supporting her as they looked out over the transformed landscape. "We did more than that," he said softly. "We proved that your father was right. The future belongs to those who aren't afraid to evolve, to become something new." Cthera's scales rippled with colors that needed no translation. Joy, pride, and something deeper, more personal. As they stood together in the growing dusk, watching the healed crystals catch the last light of day, both knew that they had changed more than just the crystal fields. They had changed themselves, their societies, and the very definition of what was possible when different species dared to work as one. The news of their success spread across Zelver Prime like a crystalline wave. Holographic displays throughout the capital showed images of the restored northwestern fields, their surfaces now gleaming with a new kind of beauty, one that merged the geometric precision of traditional Zelvirian crystals with subtle organic patterns that seemed to pulse with life. Thomas stood at the window of the Ducal Palace's highest tower, watching transport ships converge on the fields. Scientists, engineers, and nobles from across the galaxy were arriving to witness what many were already calling the Chen-Cthera synthesis, a revolutionary merger of human and Zelvirian technology that promised to save not just Zelver Prime, but countless other worlds facing similar ecological challenges. "The Galactic Council has officially recognized our success," Cthera said, entering the room. Her scales shimmered with satisfaction, but Thomas could see the wariness beneath. "Though some members are still processing the implications." "You mean they're trying to figure out how to deal with a human-Zelvirian partnership that's more successful than anyone expected?" Thomas said with a slight smile. The past month had been a whirlwind of implementation and adaptation, spreading their solution across the planet's crystal networks. "Lord Vex Thor and his faction are making one final attempt to challenge your position," Cthera said, moving to stand beside him. "They're arguing that while your technical expertise is valuable, actual leadership of the duchy should remain purely Zelvirian." Thomas turned to face her, noting how the light played across her unique scale patterns. "And what do you think?" "I think," she said carefully, "that my father's greatest wisdom wasn't in finding a solution to our environmental crisis. It was in understanding that true strength comes from embracing change, not fearing it." Her scales shifted to colors that Thomas had come to recognize as deeply personal. "The old ways would have us believe that purity, of form, of lineage, of tradition, is everything. But look at what we've achieved by daring to be different." The door chimed, announcing the arrival of the Ducal Council. It was time for the final confrontation. As they entered the Grand Council chamber, Thomas saw that every faction was present. Lord Vexthor stood at the head of the preservation faction, his scales rigid with determination. "We acknowledge the success of your environmental initiatives," Vexthor began, his voice formal. "But tradition demands." "Tradition?" Thera interrupted, her voice ringing through the chamber. "Let us speak of tradition." She activated the chamber's holographic systems, filling the air with images of Zelvirian history. "Our people rose to greatness not by clinging to the past, but by daring to evolve. The first crystal shapers were considered heretics. The first space travelers were called madmen. Every great advance in our history came from those willing to break with tradition." Thomas stepped forward, adding his own perspective. "Your civilization isn't great because it remained unchanged. It's great because it had the wisdom to recognize good ideas, regardless of their source." He gestured to the visual feeds showing the restored crystal fields. "Look at what we've created together. Not human, not Zelvirian, but something new, something stronger." A murmur ran through the council as the images shifted to show the latest data. The restored areas weren't just stable. They were thriving, showing signs of evolution and adaptation that promised even greater resilience for the future. The Galactic Council has already received 17 requests from other worlds facing similar crises. Thera added, "They don't care about tradition. They care about results, about survival." Lord Vexthor's scales had begun to show signs of uncertainty. "But the precedent we set," Thomas interrupted gently, "will be that Zelver Prime is strong enough to lead the galaxy into a new era. One where cooperation transcends old boundaries and prejudices." He turned to address the entire council. "I'm not asking you to abandon your identity. I'm asking you to expand it. To show the galaxy that true civilization isn't about maintaining barriers, but about building bridges." The chamber fell silent. Then, slowly, one of the eldest council members rose. Her scales were pale with age, but her voice was strong. "I remember when Duke Zelthor first proposed his genetic research. Many called him mad, but he saw further than we did. And now his daughter and his chosen heir have proven that vision correct." She turned to face the assembly. "I move that we formally recognize Thomas Chen as full heir to the duchy, with all rights and responsibilities thereof." The voting was not unanimous, but it was decisive. As the council dispersed, Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. But there was one more thing he needed to do. "Thera," he said, turning to the Duchess who had become so much more than an ally. "Your father chose me to be your guardian. But I think he hoped for something more, something neither of us expected when this began." Her scales rippled with emotions too complex for his interface to translate, but he no longer needed translations to understand her. "A true partnership," she said softly, "not just of technologies or civilizations, but of hearts." "They'll say it's impossible," Thomas said, taking her hand. "A human and a Zelvirian." "They said it was impossible for a human to rule a Zelvirian duchy," she replied, her scales shifting to colors that spoke of joy and possibility. "They said it was impossible to merge our technologies, to heal our world. Perhaps it's time we showed them what impossible really means." As they stood together in the chamber where their journey had begun, Thomas thought about all the changes that had brought them to this moment. He had come to Zelver Prime expecting to find a world in need of technical solutions. Instead, he had found a partner, a purpose, and a chance to prove that the greatest achievements come not from clinging to what is familiar, but from daring to embrace what is different. Outside, the crystal fields of Zelver Prime sparkled under their sun, their surfaces reflecting not just light, but the promise of a future where differences weren't barriers to be feared, but bridges to be built. A future that would be written not in terms of human or Zelvirian, but in the endless possibilities that arose when diverse peoples dared to dream, to change, and to grow together. The story of Thomas Chen and Duchess Thera was just beginning, but already it had become legend among the stars, a testament to the power of seeing beauty in difference, strength in change, and hope in the willingness to become something gloriously, impossibly new.